There are moments in history that arrive without noise, no fireworks, no grand signing ceremonies broadcast on national television. They begin quietly, with a small question, yet they hold the power to shake the destiny of an entire nation. That question appeared on a scorching afternoon in the Sahel, when a young mother carried her feverish child in her arms, standing on the dusty roadside, waiting for a passing motorbike that might take her to the nearest clinic. The wind swept across the burning pavement, and she whispered prayers under her breath, because she knew that from where she stood, the closest emergency facility was more than 35 kilometers away. Not everyone survives that distance. For so long in Burkina Faso, healthcare was not just about hospitals and medicine. Healthcare was fear. It was a race against time. It was a journey full of hope and despair that people were forced to make because they simply had no other choice. A child's asthma attack, a complicated birth, a snake bite deep in the forest, each separated only by hours, yet each deciding the thin line between life and death. And the people of this nation had learned to live with that brutal truth for far too many decades. But then in 2025, a question rose inside the presidential palace, and it changed everything. If a country that once lacked hospital beds, lacked doctors, and watched its own citizens die on the road to emergency care, suddenly decided to build 50 modern hospitals and 200 rural clinics all at once, what would happen? That was not a plan. It was not some vague ambition. It was a declaration, a turning point from which the entire country could never return to what it used to be. On November 16, 2025, Burkina Faso stepped into that moment with all the silence and weight of history. The old numbers that once strangled the dreams of its people became fuel for transformation. 2.3 doctors per 10,000 citizens. More than 32% of the population living over 40 kilometers from a health center. 43% of emergency deaths occurring simply because help did not arrive in time. These numbers were no longer statistics. They were evidence of a promise, evidence that this reality must end. And then came the statement that shifted the nation's entire healthcare map. The health of the people is the foundation of freedom. President Ibrahim Traoré was not speaking about healthcare as a service. He spoke of it as a core part of spiritual sovereignty and national dignity. Without health, there is no future. Without healthcare, there is no independence. A nation weak in healthcare will forever depend on others at the most critical moments of life and death. But hidden inside that statement was something even bigger. Freedom does not only come from victory on the battlefield or from powerful laws. Freedom comes from the breath of ordinary people, from the knowledge that if their child falls ill, if their parents collapse, if they themselves face an emergency, this country can protect them. And so the most important question of this era is not who will help Burkina Faso. The real question is whether a small nation in the harsh Sahel can heal itself and rise stronger than ever before. If you have ever believed that Africa's rise is not some distant idea but a reality unfolding every single day, then you need to hear this story to the end. Because Burkina Faso's healthcare revolution is not just about building hospitals. It is the story of a people choosing to stand tall and declare that they deserve to live, to heal, and to be respected. And that story begins right now. Before the first concrete foundations of the healthcare revolution were laid into the red earth of Burkina Faso, the country had endured long, punishing years in which health was not a basic right but a matter of sheer luck. Whether a patient lived or died often depended not on the skill of a doctor, but on the distance they had to cross in desperation. Imagine a March morning, the Sahel sun just rising, yet the dry heat already hitting skin like burning coal. In a village near the northern border, a father bursts out of his house and onto the dirt road. In his arms is his 9-year-old son, trembling violently from malaria. The nearest clinic is 40 kilometers away, and the path to get there runs through sections that turn to mud and others that are barely a faint tire track across sand. The father knows every minute is a race, but he also knows there are races in which you start already defeated. Stories like this were not rare. They repeated so often that they became part of Burkina Faso's collective memory. A woman going into labor at night but unable to reach the hospital in time. An elderly man having a heart attack while the ambulance never arrives. A snakebite victim who does not survive simply because the antivenom is hours away on a dirt road. That was the reality, cold and merciless like the statistics themselves. But behind every number was a face, a family, a pain this nation had been forced to accept for far too long. The people of Burkina Faso were never short on resilience. They were never short on endurance. But they lacked something every country needs to step into its future: a healthcare system strong enough to protect life. The tragedy, ironically, did not come from indifference but from limitation. The old healthcare system of Burkina Faso was like a blanket too small. It could cover part of the population, but the farther, poorer, more remote regions were always left exposed to the bitter cold of neglect. When a nation has only 2.3 doctors per 10,000 people, even the most dedicated teams cannot fight against deadly distances. Families developed a heartbreaking habit. They kept a small stash of cash hidden under the mattress for emergencies, not to pay hospital fees, but to pay for the journey to the hospital. They prayed before placing their child on a motorbike, not because they lacked faith, but because they knew there were stretches of road where even faith was not enough to keep someone alive. For decades, Burkina Faso had been forced to accept this as its fate, a fate in which life or death was decided not by doctors, but by geography. The nation's health maps were once full of empty spaces, spaces that represented regions the state had never reached. And in those blank spaces, people continued to live, to work, to hope, yet always with a silent fear hanging over them. Anyone who has lived through such conditions understands one truth: a weak healthcare system does not just take lives, where Russia continues to deepen its ties. It turns every household into a desperate unit of self-defense. It makes people feel that in their most fragile moments, they stand alone. And it was from this land of fear, from these repeated losses caused by nothing more than a road too far, that the later healthcare revolution became not just important, but impossible to delay any longer. To understand the magnitude of what Burkina Faso achieved in 2025, one must first face this truth: a country can only rise when it realizes that failing to act means burying its own future. This painful context is not to retell a sorrowful past, but to make one thing clear: every great awakening begins with a pain that can no longer be tolerated. And Burkina Faso reached that boundary the moment when silence was no longer an option. There are moments when a nation must ask itself whether it can continue living with old wounds. These moments do not require drums or waving flags, yet they carry enough weight to bend the direction of history. For Burkina Faso, that moment arrived on a morning in early March 2025, when President Ibrahim Traoré signed a thin document that carried an unprecedented resolve. That document was not a small directive, nor a tentative experiment. It was a clear command to the entire country: build 50 hospitals and 200 rural clinics across the nation, not in 10 years, not in 5 years, but starting immediately. The strange thing is that this historic turning point did not begin with applause. It unfolded in silence, yet it was that silence that revealed everything. Because those present in the meeting room that day understood that the country was stepping onto a path it had never walked before. A path with no model to copy, no mentor to guide them, and no safety zone to retreat to. Traoré looked directly at his advisors and spoke a sentence that would later become the backbone of the entire healthcare revolution: a people cannot call itself free if it cannot heal its own. That sentence was not meant to debate or persuade anyone. It simply stated a truth everyone knew, yet generations had been afraid to confront. Because the weakness of the healthcare system did not lie only in the lack of hospitals or doctors, it lay in how the nation thought about itself, believing it was too poor to dream of modern hospitals, believing rural regions were too far to reach, believing large-scale reform was something only rich countries could afford. These suffocating beliefs had trapped Burkina Faso in a narrow orbit for far too long. Traoré refused to accept that orbit, and he shattered it with a decision that marked a turning point. Right after the document was signed, a nationwide mobilization began to take shape. The Ministry of Health summoned experts from all 13 regions. The Ministry of Infrastructure prepared construction teams that had proven their capabilities through previous road projects. The Ministry of Finance redirected budgets to maximize domestic resources. No reliance on complex aid packages, no strings attached. only the will of a nation deciding its own direction. What made breakaway states of Burkina Faso and Mali scale, but its spirit. Burkina Faso was not building hospitals to beautify reports, not building clinics to impress the international community. The country was building for the people who had spent far too long fighting illness and death on their own. That truth transformed the project into something more than infrastructure. It became a promise that no child would die on the way to emergency care again, that no mother would give birth in crushing fear, that no family would see illness as a sentence, leaving their fate to life. When a decision carries so much pain on its shoulders, it cannot be treated like an ordinary policy. It becomes a hinge point of history, and that is exactly what happened. Only weeks later, survey teams spread across all 13 regions, measuring potential sites, meeting communities, pinpointing exactly where healthcare was needed most. The truth is that this decision did more than transform the healthcare system. It transformed how people saw their own state. For the first time, millions felt that their country was genuinely preparing to protect them, not with speeches, but with the walls of new hospitals rising before their eyes. One decision, made at the right moment, can alter destiny. And Burkina Faso found its moment on that March day, a day when the past was set aside and the future opened through the courage of a people who had endured enough pain. When the order to build 50 hospitals and 200 clinics was issued, Burkina Faso entered a period unlike anything in its modern history. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood that this was not simply about constructing healthcare facilities. This was a test of national organization, of the people's will, and above all, of the belief that this country could pull itself out of the limitations that once seemed carved into its fate. The mobilization began with the first meetings inside the Ministry of Health. Maps were spread across the tables. 13 regions appeared like 13 different realities within one nation: the Sahel region with its scattered villages, the Cascades region with its green hills isolated by harsh roads, Boucle du Mouhoun, densely populated but stitched together by fragile healthcare services. Each place was a story, and each story was a gap the state had never filled. To redraw that map, they needed a team not only strong in expertise, but patient, resilient, and willing to confront reality head-on. Within weeks, more than 1,000 engineers, doctors, administrators, and local officials were mobilized, forming survey teams divided into small groups, each group responsible for an enormous territory. They were not asked to find the easiest places to build. They were asked to find the places that needed it most. And to do that, they had to go where paper maps could no longer speak. Vehicles began leaving the capital, Ouagadougou, at dawn. Pickup trucks, off-road vehicles, even motorcycles where roads were cut by dry riverbeds. The survey teams crossed cracked fields, dense Sahel scrublands, and villages that for decades had only seen visits from international aid workers. But this time was different. The people arriving did not bring relief supplies. They brought plans. And those plans were here to stay. At each stop, the teams met village chiefs, midwives, teachers, people who had witnessed too many births in the dark and too many deaths from reaching hospitals too late. A midwife in the Center Nord region shared how some nights was so pitch black she had to place a candle by the birthing bed just to see her own hands. And when she asked whether a new clinic would truly be built, she could not hide her doubt. Not because she was pessimistic, but because she had seen too many promises left behind on paper. But this time, the survey teams were not there to take notes and leave. They came to measure, to identify water sources, to mark foundation points. The first wooden stakes driven into the soil became signals to the people. What they were witnessing was not a promise, it was a beginning. In some areas, the team spent long hours debating. A village of only 300 people, but sitting at the center of 6 smaller surrounding villages, meaning a clinic there could save thousands of lives each year. Another area had more residents but was located near a major highway, meaning they could access hospitals more easily. Decisions like these could not be rushed. They were weighed not only with logic, but with empathy for each community. For 4 continuous months, all 13 regions were surveyed in detail. The national healthcare map was redrawn from scratch with red markers pinpointing the locations with the most urgent needs. When the survey teams returned to the capital to present their findings, what surprised everyone was not the number of sites. It was what the teams brought back with them. They brought stories, faces, simple pleas like 2 words: please help. And these transformed the entire plan from a technical project into a moral mission. The nationwide mobilization across the 13 regions did not only mark the beginning of construction, it marked the beginning of a new awareness. That to change the destiny of a nation, you must start by listening to the places that have been forgotten the longest. When the survey teams returned with their detailed reports and marked coordinates, Burkina Faso stepped into the most critical phase of its healthcare revolution. If the previous phase was a journey to find the forgotten, then this next phase was the moment the nation began rewriting the fate of those places with the very first bricks. And that transformation did not unfold quietly. It unfolded right on the red Sahel soil, amid the sound of shovels hitting hardened ground, and in the eyes of people who still couldn't quite believe what they were witnessing. In August 2025, construction sites for 200 rural clinics opened simultaneously across the country. No place was too remote, no community too small to be included. Places that once required half a day of travel just to reach a hospital suddenly became the places where the first steel frames rose. In a village in Lerum province, the sound of a concrete mixer echoed through the scorching noon, drawing the whole village out to watch, not because they had never seen construction before, but because they had never seen it happening for them. An elderly man stood under a tree, leaning on his cane, watching the sight before whispering almost to himself, "So we finally get to see this." After years of watching sick villagers leave and never return, a real place of healing was rising right before their eyes. All 200 clinics followed the same model, small but complete. Each clinic had a simple yet always ready emergency room, a birthing room with better lighting than any house in the village, a medicine storage area with basic but stable temperature controls, a team of 12 medical staff including at least 1 doctor, 2 midwives and a lab technician. It wasn't anything extravagant, but for many rural regions it was the difference between life and death. The first walls rising changed the atmosphere of entire communities. Children ran around the construction sites as if circling a new miracle. Women arrived early in the morning to watch the progress, carrying water for the workers as if they were caring for their own home. Village chiefs stood at a distance, nodding quietly each time something new was completed. But perhaps the most heart-piercing moments came from the softest whispers. A young mother stood beside a half-finished steel frame, her newborn in her arms, telling a midwife from the survey team, "This baby almost didn't make it." If this clinic had been built just 1 year earlier, things might have been different. No one replied, but their eyes said they understood every word. Across all 200 sites, construction moved with a speed that astonished even the most optimistic observers. Not because the workers were rushing, but because they knew every day of delay could cost a life. And so the builders worked not only with their hands, they worked with the belief that each brick was a contribution to someone else's survival. When the first clinics neared completion, something unprecedented happened. People from the surrounding villages began gathering each afternoon on the patch of land in front of the construction sites. They didn't come to watch the building. They came because these places were the first in years that made them feel safe. The half-painted walls already carried the promise that when disaster struck, they would no longer have to run far. By late September, many clinics were ready for basic services. The first consultations took place in an atmosphere filled with emotion. A feverish child was carried into the emergency room not after a journey of dozens of kilometers, but within minutes. A mother in labor was brought into the birthing room not in the dead of night, but in a brightly lit space with the smell of fresh paint. 200 rural clinics were not just infrastructure, they were a long overdue apology from a nation to the people who had lived too long in neglect. And more importantly, they were a promise that from now on their lives would no longer depend on distance. If 200 rural clinics were the new veins reaching into forgotten regions, then 50 modern hospitals were the beating heart of the healthcare transformation. They were not merely constructions. They were the declaration of a nation that had decided it would never bow to fate again, and their emergence, rising out of the vast Sahel, felt like a thunderclap announcing a new era. In October 2025, When the first steel frames of the Bobo Dioulasso Hospital rose from the ground, the images spread quickly across national social media. A construction site spanning dozens of hectares, hundreds of workers under the blazing sun, cranes turning against the dry blue Sahel sky. For a nation that once had to send its critical patients across borders to be treated, that scene was nothing short of a powerful awakening. Each hospital was designed with a scale previously seen only in models from developed countries. 18 emergency rooms operating around the clock, 6 fully equipped operating theaters, a 40-bed intensive care unit modeled after international standards from the post-pandemic era, a separate isolation ward equipped with automated air filtration and sterilization systems. This was not just architecture. It was a structure for life, one the country had never owned before. But what made the construction process remarkable was not only the scale, it was the speed. Within 6 weeks, several hospitals had already completed their foundations, and long rows of concrete walls began rising like a race against time itself. Drone cameras captured white buildings emerging from red soil, with curved steel roofs stretching out like wings opening toward the future. There were moments that witnesses would never forget. At one hospital site in Soum province, under a heat of 105 degrees, the construction team continued pouring concrete for the emergency wing. A young worker turned to a journalist and said, "I'm not building walls, I'm building hope for this entire region." That sentence spread like a wave, leaving anyone who read it silent, because it captured everything the people of Burkina Faso had waited for decades. The presence of these new hospitals also reshaped community life in profound ways. In a small town in the Est region, residents gathered each evening at the end of the main road to look at the rising steel structure, not to take photos, not out of curiosity. They came because of the peace they felt, something they had never known before, the feeling that if something happened, they would no longer be alone. A mother spoke through tears as she watched the hospital rise. "My oldest daughter died on the road to emergency care. Now I can tell my younger daughter that it won't happen to her." Those words from an ordinary citizen carried more power than any speech. It wasn't just the people who felt the shift. Doctors, who had been exhausted by the old system, now saw a future for their profession being reborn. Many who had planned to move abroad began reconsidering, because for the first time, they saw their country investing in healthcare not as an experiment, but as an irreversible commitment. The story of the hospitals also attracted attention across Africa. Health ministers from Ghana, Niger, Mali, and Côte d'Ivoire sent delegations to study the model. Many experts called it the most impressive healthcare sprint in West Africa in 20 years. From the first walls to the completed structures, the 50 modern hospitals became more than a milestone for the health sector. They became a declaration in concrete and steel that Burkina Faso would no longer rely on the world's sympathy. When hospitals rise, sovereignty takes shape. When emergency care arrives on time, freedom gains meaning. And when a nation decides to heal itself, no force can push it back into the shadows. When the rural clinics began taking shape and the steel frames of new hospitals rose above the red earth, the first change was not in healthcare statistics or technical reports. The first change happened in the minds of the people. A nation can be poor, it can be lacking, but when trust returns, everything begins to move like water, finally finding its way back to the sea. In Burkina Faso, that shift became so visible it could be felt with the naked eye. For years, people had lived with hopelessness, passed down from one generation to the next. They were used to expecting nothing from the state except promises. They were used to believing that rural regions would always remain forgotten dots on the map. But then one small shift cracked that old belief. The simple sight of the first construction site. That alone was enough to make long-standing doubt begin to fracture. In a town in the Hots-Bassins region, when the new hospital reached its second floor, an elderly man told a reporter, "For the first time in my life, I feel like the government knows we exist." His words were simple, yet they carried a profound truth. For many years, the suffering of the people did not come only from lacking resources, it came from the feeling of being forgotten. And when the construction projects advanced everywhere, everything changed. Trust did not return in a burst. It came like a thin beam of light slipping through a door after a very long night. By late November 2025, the Ministry of Health conducted an internal survey on how citizens felt about the new healthcare system. The results surprised even the most optimistic leaders. Confidence in state institutions, long submerged at the bottom, rose by more than 20% in just a few months. Not because the hospitals were finished, not because services had transformed, simply because people saw that this time a promise was truly turning into action. Across many communities, the shift was even clearer in everyday conversations. Where people once talked about fearing malaria without medicine or traveling dozens of kilometers in the dark to give birth, they now talked about the opening date of the new clinic, about their sons wanting to become nurses, about a future that could finally look different from the past. In Culpelogo province, a primary school teacher said her students were suddenly writing essays titled, "I want to become a doctor." Before, to rural children, becoming a doctor felt as distant as reaching the moon. But when a clinic rose before their eyes, that dream no longer seemed far away. Among all these changes, one transformation stood out the most. The rebuilding of trust between citizens and the state trust that had been torn apart by years of conflict and instability. And this renewal did not come from a military victory or a financial reform. It came from the walls of new hospitals rising to save ordinary people. This shift reached local officials as well. Village chiefs, mayors, and regional leaders who once felt powerless now found themselves part of the rollout. They discussed land, water sources, and access roads. They coordinated with engineers and doctors. They began to feel that they could truly shape the future of the places they were born. In many areas, this cooperation created a scene Burkina Faso had not witnessed in years. The people and the government standing on the same side. No more mutual suspicion. No more sense of opposition. When the hospitals gave everyone a shared goal, people realized there were things far greater than their differences. But perhaps the most beautiful symbol of the change came from young mothers bringing their children to the temporary pre-opening checkups. One mother in Boucle du Mouhoun said, "I lost a child because we couldn't reach the hospital in time. Now I know this one will grow up in a different country." Her words were not just from a mother. They were the declaration of a generation that believes the future can be better than the past. And that belief is what makes this healthcare revolution the greatest social transformation Burkina Faso has ever experienced. As Burkina Faso's healthcare construction sites kept producing unprecedented milestones, the changes did not only shake the confidence of its people, they began to spill beyond its borders, crossing the Sahel desert, entering the cold meeting rooms of international organizations, and slipping into the agendas of governments that had long viewed Burkina Faso as a minor peripheral state. The first shock appeared in regional media. African newspapers that once reported only on security crises and famine in Burkina Faso suddenly began dedicating front pages to the country's hospital building speed. A newspaper in Accra called it the fastest healthcare sprint in West Africa since 1999. The words carried admiration and curiosity. Everyone understood that building 50 hospitals and 200 clinics at once was no simple feat, especially for a nation often dismissed for its weak administrative capacity. In Ghana, health ministers held closed-door meetings to discuss whether Burkina Faso's model could be replicated. In Niger, Mali, and Côte d'Ivoire, internal memos were exchanged analyzing each phase of the rollout. Several countries quickly sent delegations to observe the projects firsthand. They didn't just want to learn. They wanted to understand how a nation once considered the weakest in the region could transform so powerfully. While Africa began to see Burkina Faso as a new example, the West responded with initial silence, followed quickly by concern. In Brussels, European Union advisors debated intensely whether Burkina Faso's healthcare independence could trigger broader shifts in Africa-Europe relations. One expert reportedly said during the meeting, "If they can build their own hospital network, they won't depend on our aid anymore. And if they aren't dependent, they won't listen to us the way they used to." End quote. In Paris, strategic research institutes analyzed every drone video of the rising structures, even marking the exact coordinates on maps to project the stability Burkina Faso might soon achieve. An internal report from a prominent think tank concluded, "A nation with a strong health system is difficult to destabilize from the outside." That single line was enough to draw the attention of policymakers. Meanwhile, in Washington, a November 2025 USAID assessment surprised many experts. It stated clearly that Burkina Faso had demonstrated administrative capability far beyond expectations. This wasn't just about healthcare. It signaled a nation entering an autonomous trajectory. The emphasis lay on the word autonomous. In diplomatic language, that is more than an assessment. It is a warning of a shifting balance of influence. Non-governmental organizations could not ignore the shift either. Several admitted that if the new clinic network operated well, the need for emergency health aid would drop sharply. For them, this meant the traditional humanitarian assistance model, which had lasted for decades, might no longer be relevant in Burkina Faso. The world looked at Burkina Faso with mixed attitudes, admiration, skepticism, calculation, but no matter the viewpoint, one fact was undeniable. Burkina Faso had stepped out of its old place in the global imagination. A country once appearing in news headlines only for conflict had become the topic of strategic discussions. What made this upheaval even more profound was the truth that Burkina Faso did not issue bold declarations. There were no provocations, no dramatic slogans. They simply built hospitals and clinics. Yet sometimes, what shifts the balance of power is not fiery speeches, but silent decisions that transform the daily lives of millions. When a nation decides to heal its own people, it becomes harder to influence, harder to manipulate, harder to control. And that is precisely why Burkina Faso has forced the world to pay attention. This healthcare revolution is no longer a domestic story. It has become a geopolitical signal, a sign that Africa is stepping into an era where its nations will shape their own future. For months, the people of Burkina Faso had seen only massive construction sites, clinics rising from red soil, and hospital towers taking shape under the Sahel Sunday. To them, that alone was a miracle. They thought this healthcare revolution lived entirely in concrete, in steel, in the walls themselves. But the deepest transformation was not in anything the eye could see. It was hidden beneath the quiet infrastructure, like the underground currents of a nation. The surprise emerged one morning in December 2025 during a small press conference held by the Ministry of Digital Development. Few people paid attention. There were no crowds of foreign journalists. It was just a short technical announcement. But few knew that this line of text would turn the hospital building effort into an unprecedented sovereignty strategy. The ministry declared that all 50 hospitals and 200 clinics would operate on a national, fully domestic medical data system. No foreign service, no international platforms, no patient records, emergency logs, or medical information falling under the control of any external entity. Every piece of data would be stored, managed, and protected inside a digital infrastructure entirely controlled by the Burkinabe state. At first, many dismissed this as a technical detail, but those who understood power realized instantly how monumental it was. Because in the 21st century, the nation that controls its data controls its future. Before this, many African countries relied on international storage systems. Imagine a country whose entire medical records were kept on a server in a distant land. Imagine an emergency system dependent on a platform that could be shut down instantly over political disagreements. Imagine a nation unable to manage its own outbreaks because it lacked a sovereign digital framework. Burkina Faso understood these risks, and they decided to break dependency not through political speeches, but through a strategic technical decision. A cybersecurity analyst in Accra wrote, "This is more than building hospitals. This is building national autonomy in the most sensitive domain." And it did not stop there. The Ministry of Digital Development announced Phase 2, a satellite-based emergency communication network designed with regional engineers capable of functioning even if the entire telecom grid collapsed or the power went out. This system used low bandwidth signals, allowing remote health posts in the deepest rural areas to call for help and receive guidance with a device no larger than a palm. This was no longer the story of clinics. It was the story of sovereign crisis management. A hospital can be overwhelmed. A road can be blocked. But an independent emergency network can save thousands simply by ensuring that a call for help never goes silent. From foreign embassies, analysis reports were sent home day after day. Several countries admitted openly that Burkina Faso was breaking out of the usual Sahel paradigm. A nation capable of protecting its medical data and running an independent emergency system was a nation difficult to monitor, difficult to manipulate, and extremely difficult to pressure. That is why the world called this a healthcare revolution. But in closed-door meetings, experts used another phrase, a soft sovereignty revolution, because hospitals can be bombed, roads can be blocked, but a secure domestic data system and an independent satellite emergency network are tools no outside force can easily destroy. And that was the twist no one saw coming. Burkina Faso was not just building hospitals. It was building a new layer of independence that very few developing nations possess. A layer with no color, no sound, but one that changes how the country stands in the world. When a nation heals itself with buildings, that is progress. But when a nation heals itself with data, digital infrastructure, and crisis-resilient systems, that is power. For decades, the story of Burkina Faso had always been painted in shades of scarcity, instability, and fragile lives. But by the end of 2025, as construction projects rose from the red earth, a new truth began to form. This was no longer the story of a nation trying to survive. It was the story of a nation healing itself. And that healing did not happen in grand ceremonies. It happened in small, quiet, ordinary moments that carried the weight of a lifetime. One of those moments took place at a new clinic in the Centre-Sud region. It was the first day the clinic opened for trial emergency cases. That morning, as sunlight hit the new sheet metal roof, a father rushed in, carrying his feverish child. If this had happened a few months earlier, he would have had to travel over 30 kilometers on a pothole-filled road. This time, it took 5 minutes. The child was placed on a bed. The doctor checked his temperature, started fluids, and brought the fever under control with practiced calm. Everything was simple, routine, nothing remarkable by the standards of wealthy nations. But for that father, it was the moment that brought tears to his eyes. When the doctor said the child would be fine, he collapsed into a chair, covered his face with his hands, and stayed silent for a long time. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't have to watch his child fight malaria alone. That was where the healthcare revolution reached its deepest impact. It didn't just save lives. It restored dignity to people who had been forced to accept suffering as a natural part of existence. Not far away, at a nearly completed hospital, a young doctor stood watching the brightly lit third floor of the new intensive care unit as engineers tested the electrical system. She had once been among the many health workers planning to leave the country because of the unbearable working conditions. But now, seeing the place where she would soon work, equipped, stocked, and spacious enough to save lives, she whispered to a colleague, "This is the first time I want to stay." That sentence spread quickly through the medical community because it wasn't just personal emotion. It was a sign that the reform was not only saving patients, it was keeping the hearts of those who heal. One afternoon in the Sahel region, people gathered around what would soon be the main lobby of the Soum Provincial Hospital. The white walls had just been completed, and the harsh golden sunlight reflected off the new tiles. An elderly woman sat on a stone nearby, looked at the building, and told her grandchild, "In my day, hospitals were something we only heard about on the radio. Now it's right in front of you." The child didn't fully understand, but stared at the building with wide eyes. Across the country, quiet conversations like this, repeated every day. And those moments formed the true climax of this story. Not the construction speed, not the number of hospitals, but the fact that every layer of the population, young and old, began to feel they were entering a new era, where death was no longer an unexpected consequence of lacking an emergency room, where they no longer prayed through the fear of a long journey for help. The change was so profound that even people who once viewed the country through a lens of pessimism were forced to admit it. For the first time in years, Burkina Faso had a future no longer determined by chance or fear, but by its own efforts. And as hospitals neared completion, as clinics lit up at night, as stories spread across regions, people began to realize something they had never dared to imagine. A nation does not need wealth or powerful allies to build its future. A nation only needs to believe that the lives of its own people are worth fighting for, worth investing in, worth protecting at all costs. Burkina Faso did exactly that. And in the moment a child was saved right where he lived, the revolution reached its climax. It was no longer infrastructure, no longer a project. It was rebirth. As 2025 came to an end, Burkina Faso was no longer the country the world had been accustomed to seeing. The news headlines, once filled with instability, poverty, and the lingering consequences of history, now made room for something entirely different. The glow of rural clinics lighting up the Sahel night, the towering hospitals casting shadows over red dust roads. The faces of ordinary people who, for the first time in many years, could breathe with relief and believe that tomorrow would be better than today. But that moment only truly matters when we look back at the journey the nation walked. Every remote region, every distant village, every story of families who lost loved ones on the road to emergency care together, they form the backdrop for the rise of Burkina Faso. A rise that did not begin with massive aid packages or elaborate economic strategies. It began with a simple determination, not to let people die from things that should have been preventable. In that journey, the physical constructions were only the visible part. The deeper, stronger foundation was the shared spirit of the entire population. When citizens and government stood on the same side, when doctors and engineers worked together under the burning sun, when mothers brought water for construction workers, when children watched each brick being laid, they weren't just building hospitals, they were rebuilding trust in their own country. And that trust spread faster than any information campaign ever could. It moved through village meetings, through roadside stalls where people discussed construction progress, through the eyes of children who looked at hospitals the way others look at miracles. No one told them to believe. They believed because they saw it with their own eyes. That is what made Burkina Faso's transformation so enduring. Change built on trust cannot be destroyed by external turmoil. It does not depend on aid. It does not depend on international institutions. It depends on a nation collectively acknowledging that human dignity must be protected. When we look at Burkina Faso's health map in early 2026, we do not just see new dots. We see a system reconnected after years of fragmentation. We see emergency travel distances reduced by dozens of kilometers. We see millions of people able to reach care in a fraction of the time. And we see hopes that were once buried slowly return to life. The strangest, most beautiful part is that this rise did not come with loud slogans. No grand parades, no triumphant declarations. Instead, it came from peaceful mornings in rural clinics where a child received a vaccine on time, from quiet afternoons in hospitals where a mother safely welcomed her newborn under the warm glow of golden lights, from everyday moments that seemed ordinary, but for this nation, they were the first bricks of true freedom. And when we step back to look at the full journey, we understand the most important truth. Sovereignty is not only political. Sovereignty is when a nation can safeguard its own people's lives. Sovereignty is when no one can use our suffering as leverage. Sovereignty is when we stand up, mend the wounds history left behind,